All right. Well, that'll have to do. I didn't really adjust anything. It went out around 4:30 my time and came back around 6:20 or so. So, a couple hours. It was really annoying. It actually went out. Hey, Santolo, how's it going? It went out just as I was finishing up these slides. So I didn't quite get as I was planning to do some examples at the end, but we're gonna have to wing that. Oh well. I also just had dinner delivered, so a little bit of a mukbang stream as well. Yeah, it was pretty rough. I mean, annoying as all hell. But at least they got it. I was really worried because after I posted my last update, around 6, shortly after that, I got a notice estimating that they were going to fix it by 11:30 tonight. And I was just like, oh, fuck. That's going to be terrible. But we are here. That is fair, Tuffy. Even though that is a mythological rule that students tell each other, no university or college I know of has that rule, but it's a Twitch rule, so it works. How is everyone doing today? I know I saw most of you in streams earlier, but that is true. If you don't show up in the school of life, people move on without you. Running Ethernet around your apartment, watching Jeevan's run. Oh yeah, Jeevan is getting pretty far, isn't he? Has he gotten to Santa Barbara? He's in SB. Amazing, amazing. Well, I would pause to watch him, but then that would take this even later than it's going to already be. But I hope he succeeds. Okay. I guess we should probably get started. Um, so anybody try to do the homework? I know Kiwi did. I don't know how far she got. How far did you get, Kiwi? Yep. This is what we're going to be working on today. You got about half of it completed. Well, that's pretty good. That is pretty good. Yes, we're going to do some diagramming today. Lol is right. Um, to really diagram, though, you have to start by being able to identify the lexical categories. Parts of speech are sort of where things start at the beginning, and so we can look at the things that are going on here. I have, let's see. Yeah. So I have prepared an answer key to the stuff that I gave for homework, and there we are. So I will put a link to this in the Discord after class, right? You had a lot of problems with things you were taught in school contradicting what you want to do. That Kiwi is actually excellent, right? And I hope that there were one or two points that I very deliberately did not go into the last time, because what I wanted was to get you thinking about a few of these issues. Hopefully some of these things are Russian is an adjective. Yes. If you think about it, Russia is a noun, right? Russian, adding the an ending, is an adjective forming kind of thing, right? Now you can say a Russian, meaning a Russian person, right? We'll actually talk about that kind of category when we go over noun phrases in detail in a couple of weeks. So like a lot of this stuff, I'm not going to go through every single word, right? But which were some of the ones, Kiwi? I mean, I know you mentioned way in chat to me, but what were some of the other things that that you were second guessing yourself on in terms of the way you were taught? Subordinator, determiner, by the way, determiners go with nouns. So you're going to see a determiner or determinative at the beginning of a noun phrase, right? You're going to see a subordinator at the beginning of a subordinate clause, right? Did we get any subordinators in this? I'm not sure we did. At least not words that are pure subordinators. There are words in here, which we'll talk more about them much later, which are pronouns, which also have a subordinating function. So. Okay. Never spoke was one you had some problems with. Okay. So, one of the things you should do when you're having trouble is to take out words and see how you would analyze it then, right? So, let's see. So notice we have never shared, and then let's see. Yeah. Okay. So notice we have never shared, never spoke, right? Those are exactly parallel, right? But if you're not sure what to do with it, like notice who shared secrets, right? If we get rid of never from the sentence, it still makes perfect grammatical sense, right? Do you see how shared is pretty clearly a verb? All right. So So then we add back in never and ask, okay, what is this doing, right? It's flipping the polarity, basically, positive to negative, of the verb shared. So it's changing the verb. In other words, it's modifying the verb. So it's an adverb, right? Does that make sense? Yeah, very common words like never, you look at them and you're like, what the hell is this really? Like, I've seen this all the time. I'm not quite sure what it's doing. But if you think about it, it's an adverb. Now, let's see. You wanted everything to be a subordinator if it described the quantity of something. So quantities of something are basically going to be determiners. Not, so D, not sub. The, let's see, what did we have? So like 2 Germans, right? Killed 2 Germans. If you notice, that is basically the same slot that you could put a the in. So a subordinator is going to be the thing that makes a clause subordinate. Basically, subordinators introduce subordinate clauses. We're going to be looking at subordinate clauses later, not in the next few weeks. But so a word like basically the way that we're analyzing the language, there are only a handful of subordinators, really, in the strict true sense. Traditional grammar has a lot more. It talks about like a lot of words being subordinators if they introduce a clause. But that, whether, and if, when if is not being used in the conditional sense, are subordinators, and that's about it. It's actually a very small category of words. A lot of functional categories don't have very many words in them. So, but don't worry about it. The functional ones, they happen so frequently that with a little bit of practice, you'll have them down and it'll be automatic, because there just aren't that many words in those categories, and you'll learn them pretty quickly. All right. I'm curious, what did you do with knife, Kiwi? Did you say that was a noun or an adjective? You had it as an adjective. Yeah. I thought that might be the case. There are a number of things here describing a type of fighter. And so it is. But I want to talk about this. I have a slide that I'll go later. We can go to it now. Okay. So the knife in Knife Fighter does, on the surface, look like an adjective. Why didn't I mark it as an adjective? I marked it as a noun. Now, traditional grammar, right, what your teachers in school probably tell you, would call it an adjective. But if we look at things, it actually behaves very differently from an adjective. Okay, so let's compare a knife fighter with a fierce fighter, right? So fierce is unquestionably an adjective, all right? Now, if you compare the 2 columns here, right? So I've marked with stars the ones that aren't grammatical, right? Speak up if you disagree with any of my judgments here. So a knife fighter and a fierce fighter, they're both fine. So in other words, both knife and fierce can be used in what we're calling the attributive modification function, right? It's an attributive modifier of it. But can you say the fighter seems knife? You can say the fighter seems fierce. Notice this pattern here is we have a linking verb like seems, and after it we have an adjective, right? We talked about this pattern. Fierce is here. Hey, Tasia, how you doing? So the fighter seems fierce, right? Notice we can also, because it's a classic adjective, we can modify it for grade. A very fierce fighter, right? But can you say a very knife fighter? No, right? You can say a fiercer fighter. So notice we can add the er for comparative grade, but you can't say a knifer fighter. Okay, so in other words, if we ignore the first column, the next three are, or the first row, I mean, the next three rows are all things that normal adjectives can do, right? Fierce can do all three of these. Knife can't do any of these three, right? Then, notice you can say, I saw a knife, but I saw a fierce? No. Right? The knife is here, the fierce is here? No. One knife, two knives, one fierce, two fierces? No. Right? A fighter with a knife, a fighter with a fierce. So a knife fighter, notice, is equivalent to saying a fighter with a knife. We can convert this into a preposition phrase with a knife, right? But you can't do that with an adjective. On Twitch you can. Okay. Yeah. I mean, you can do anything. Like, I mean, even the ones that are starred, in some sense, you can do it because I have done it by giving you the adjective, the example. Exactly, Tuffy, but you capitalized it. You can see a fierce is a proper noun, right? Or one example of a proper noun. Exactly. In which case it's been converted, right? But now we're not using it in the same meaning as we are here, right? So, and then there are some other things. Let's see, did I actually finish the slides on this or not? We're about to find out. Nope. That's the second thing I want to talk about. All right. So yeah, I did. This is one of the disadvantages of the power failure is I didn't get all my slides done in time. So when we're looking at something like the knife fighter, essentially what we're saying is that that modifier has all the attributes of a noun and none of the attributes of an adjective, except that it comes in front of an adjective and modifies it, right? So in fact, what we say is not that this is an adjective. I mean, there are other ways in which it differs. Like, so for example, you can stack the knife fighter. That this has to come. The word knife has to come immediately before fighter, right? If you have adjectives, if you could say the fierce knife fighter, right? You could say the fierce young knife fighter. You can say the fierce young handsome knife fighter, right? I have slides prepared for the pitfalls that are present here, right? That I know from experience people are going to have issues with. So notice I can stack as many actual adjectives in front of knife as I want. And I can, although it might sound a little bit less felicitous, I can flip around the order of those adjectives, right? I could say the handsome, young, fierce knife fighter. I could say the fierce, young, handsome knife fighter, right? The young, fierce, handsome knife. Like I can flip those around. But notice I cannot put knife anywhere except right before fighter, right? I can't say the knife young fighter, right? The fierce, like once I say knife, I'm committed to another noun right after it, right? In other words, this particular modifier, not only does it behave like a noun in all ways, but it has a positional restriction that is different from adjectives, right? The easiest conclusion here, like one thing you could say theoretically, and this is essentially what traditional grammar does, is we're going to call this an adjective even though it doesn't behave at all like an adjective except in this one way that it's modifying it, right? Or the alternative one is we can say this is a noun and things other than adjectives can modify nouns, right? And because it's a noun modifier, it appears in its own special position. It has its own special rules for modifying other nouns, right? And so that's because that explains more facts than the traditional count, that's the one we're going to go with, right? So if you see this kind of pattern, right, or something like knife, which in isolation looks like a noun, and it comes right in front of another noun, it's not converting categories, it's still a noun, right? And there's a couple of others here. I marked them. Let's see. Oh, like sugar ants. That's another one. Harassed by sugar ants. So this is a kind of ant, right? But it's still, sugar is still a noun. It's not converting in any way. Home games, right? Home is still a noun, for that kind of thing. Okay. Does that all make sense? Does anyone have any questions about the logic as to why we call that a noun instead of an adjective? Okay. Now, the second one that I wanted to spend a little time talking about, I put comments, and you can review the document and check it over carefully yourself at leisure. So for these, but the other one I wanted to talk about in a little bit of detail is unpleasant here in the unpleasant, who shied away from mentioning the unpleasant, right? And if you said that unpleasant was a noun, you did the logical, ordinary thing because it comes right in front of the, right? That is a completely natural choice. However, if we think about it a little bit, there are some issues with that. The first thing, notice that unpleasant in the abstract, like if we said this is an unpleasant situation, what part of speech would you say unpleasant was? Exactly. It would be an adjective, right? So the question is, has it converted by virtue of the fact that it's appearing in front of the? So one of the first things we note is we have a way of changing unpleasant into an obvious noun, which is to add the morpheme ness to the end, right? The ness is a morpheme whose primary function is to take adjectives and convert them into abstract nouns, right? Happy gives happiness, right? Friendly, friendliness. you know, whatever other ones you could think of, right? So, and notice the recent unpleasantness, like if I stick recent, which is, again, clearly an adjective, in front of unpleasantness, a noun, it makes perfect sense. So the recent unpleasant isn't grammatical, right? Also, we can't say an unpleasant, but we can say an unpleasantness, right? And now here's the kicker. The most unpleasant, right? Versus the most unpleasantness. Remember, most is one of our grade forming words, right? You know, more unpleasant, most unpleasant. That goes in front of adjectives, right? So in this particular case, what we actually have is an adjective, and we'll talk about how to analyze this in detail when we cover noun phrases, right? But basically, we have an adjective, and then we don't have a noun, but we have a noun phrase. There are plenty of other examples of this, although it's a restricted category. It's not like everything. Think about if you talk about the poor, like the poor are always with us, right? Now you might be inclined to call poor a noun, but notice the very poor are always with us, right? The most poor require the most help, right? Something like that. So in other words, even though there's no actual overt noun in this phrase, the adjective still seems to stay an adjective, right? And adding, if you can add very or most in front of it and it still works, that's a really good indicator that it's still an adjective, right? We'll come back to this. I'll show you more examples when we cover noun phrases, okay? Before I move on, were there other particular parts of the homework that you had specific questions about? Like I said, I'll make this available online so you can go check it for yourself. But if there's anything that you were looking at and you weren't sure about, it's a good time to ask. Excellent. Good to hear it. All right. So this evening, what I want to talk about primarily is what we call constituent analysis. In other words, what we're going to be doing is taking all those individual words that we've been looking at and trying to figure out how they work in larger units. So this is sometimes called parsing a sentence, although really traditional parsing is sort of, you would not want to do really traditional parsing. The word parsing, which is now used in like computer science and all those kind of things, originally actually comes from the Latin pars rationis, which is just part of speech. Part of speech is just a word-for-word translation of pars rationis. So parsing, you're taking the parts of speech, literally, and what they used to have students do back in the day, and by back in the day, I'm talking about like early 19th century and before, is you would give them a string of text like I gave you, And they wouldn't just have to name the part of speech, they would have to tell you like everything about the declension. This is third person singular present, blah blah blah, and you would just kind of go through. If you think, I mean, this is truly mind-numbingly rote sort of stuff. We are not going to be doing that. But what we're going to be doing is analyzing the structure and not just sort of naming all the individual parts, but looking at how they fit together. So we're looking at what the general term for these units is, a constituent, right? So when I'm talking about a constituent of language, that's a catch-all term that includes all the specific kinds of things we're going to be looking at, like phrases and clauses, and there's a few others that we will encounter along the way. So any word or group of words that functions in a sentence as a unit, that's a constituent. Wait, how did I go backwards here? Okay. Now, one of the things that I do want to emphasize before we get started, especially since I was just talking about this idea of parsing and what we were doing last week, where you were just, identifying the parts of speech, the whole string of words, is a lot of people think language works like the picture on the left, which, does anybody recognize where that comes from? Curious how good your cultural knowledge of American Saturday morning television is. It is exactly Kiwi. Yes. Conjunction, junction, what's your function? So the way they ask you, if any of you, I assume Kiwi has seen this, but for those of you who might not have seen it, this was one of the Schoolhouse Rock shows that were made in the early 70s mostly, and played on US television, like Saturday morning and stuff for decades, right? On basic sort of educational topics. And they were all set to song and stuff. And the way they're inviting you to think about language here is as a series of train cars that you link up one after the other. And when you're simply looking at conjunctions by themselves, that's actually not a terrible way to look at it, right? But if you think about all of language that way, as simply stringing one word after the other in sequence, you're going to be missing some really valuable ways of thinking about language. So instead of thinking about it as train cars, think about it as one of these sets of Russian dolls. Okay? In other words, language is hierarchical. You have units that go inside other units. You open up a big unit and you find another unit of sometimes looking exactly the same. It's just shoved inside the other one. And then you open that one up and you find another one in. This hierarchy is a fundamental feature of, some people argue, all human languages. That actually gets us into, whether or not that's actually true, gets us into some very complicated and fraught linguistic debates, which we won't get into here. But it's certainly true that the vast majority of languages, uncontroversially, work by this sort of embedding of one thing into another. And if there is an exception, it's like only one possible language has been identified that is an exception. Davey, how are you doing? Good to see you. All right. So let's talk a little bit about constituents, right? And we will start, actually, before we talk about constituents, because things got started late, I had made myself a cocktail on the early side, which I have now finished, and I want another one. This whole power situation has me annoyed as anything. So give me just 1 minute. I'll be right back. See if you can identify, anybody know where that comes from without Googling it? Mark Twain? No. It's actually Leo Tolstoy. It's from Anna Karenina. You looked it up. Yeah, no shame in that. I asked just because it's one of those famous opening sentences from literature. So, all happy families resemble one another, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So, in order to sort of figure out how the sentence breaks down, we can just sort of divide it up, right? Notice, first of all, so Davey, we were talking about this just before you came in. A constituent is sort of a generic term for any unit that, like either individual word or string of words that has a kind of unitary function. In other words, it functions as a whole within a sentence. This is a catch-all term that covers, like everything, like a phrase, a clause, and a bunch of other things. They're all constituents. All right. So this is just the generic way to refer to anything that behaves as a whole within the sentence. Right. So notice I basically split this sentence in two, right? All happy families resemble one another, right? And by the way, in case anybody is coming in or lurking here, do not hesitate to ask a question if you've come in late or you got distracted for part of the lecture, because you're watching, somebody get to the beach or whatever it might be. That's fine. Go ahead. I don't mind answering the same question multiple times. I want you all to understand what's happening. So please don't hang back from that, right? So all happy families resemble one another. Now, notice that definitely seems like a unit, doesn't it? Like if we wanted, we could put a period after another, and it could stand as a complete sentence, right? The same thing for the second part. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, right? So that also seems to be a unit. And we can break down each of those halves further. Notice all happy families, right? That's a unit. We could replace it, say, with a pronoun, right? They resemble one another. So notice one word can replace all happy families, right? Resemble one another. Again, that's a unit, right? Each unhappy family, that's a unit. Is unhappy in its own way, that's a unit, right? So when we're looking at constituency, we're looking at this kind of breaking down. Now, we'll put labels to all these units in a minute, right? But I just want to make sure the general idea of what we're doing here is, reasonably transparent. The biggest constituent, the thing that we're going to be spending the most time looking at, is a phrase, okay? Now, I'm going to give you a specific technical, well, semi-technical at this point. It's not super technical. But I'm going to give you a more technical definition of a phrase than is commonly given. And then we're going to look at the implications of that definition for what we're looking at. Okay. So when we're talking about a phrase, we're talking about something that's built around one main word. This word is called the head word of the phrase. And it can have optionally these other dependent elements that add extra information, either modifying or specifying, something else about it. Okay. So, stupid old man. I'm assuming everybody, probably most people in chat know this, right? Know where I got it, in other words. So, man here is the head word. Stupid and old are very appropriate emote, Kiwi. Stupid and old are specifying something about the man, right? They're, giving additional qualities about the man. So those are the dependent terms, and man is the head term, okay? To rush this. You don't get to rush this. So rush is the verb, right? This is what's being rushed. So again, it's adding some extra information to the basic rushing idea here. And then to is a marker of the infinitive, for this. Old men like golf. Exactly. Tuffy gets it. I, however, do not like golf. Maybe I'm not old enough yet. Now, hey, nothing. Got at least 20 more years. I don't know. When I was a kid, my grandfather was incredibly into golf. He played golf all the time. And when I would go out and visit, he'd have me caddy for him. And occasionally he got me lessons with the golf pro. Never took to it. Now, admittedly, that was when I was probably 10 or 12 years old. So maybe my opinions would change. But yes, hey, but yeah, Davey, you're allowed to like golf. We don't kink shame here. Kappa. Oh, really? I could see why, if you're forced to play, that might be that might be a good way to kill the enjoyment of it. All right. So when we're looking at phrases, we're going to give them names. After that, meh, yeah. Golf is one of those things that, like surf. I was talking about how surfing takes, you have to get good at it before it gets fun. I think golf is another one of those. If you're not good at it, not 24/7 fun, yeah. Fair. It was Samuel Johnson, the dictionary writer that I quoted a few weeks back about the futility of trying to stop language change, who defined golf as a good walk spoiled. Yeah, no worries, Duffy. I mean, I, of course, set the stage by using examples from the golf scene. So, the reason why we're concerned about the head word is because the head word of a phrase, and that tells you a lot about what the phrase can do in the larger sentence. And for that reason, we're going to name the type of phrase based on the head word. So, for example, right, Stalin's demands at Yalta, right? So the head word here is demands. What part of speech is that? Exactly right. It is a noun. So we call that whole thing a noun phrase, right? Is that going to work? Yeah. So what kind of phrase do you think the next one is? It's a verb phrase. Exactly. So notice here, walk the dog to the park. If we think about the other elements here, the dog is what's being walked, right? To the park is where it's being walked. So, both of those are adding extra. Walked is the center of that. How about happy with the result? What kind of phrase is that? Okay, let's think. We got a split opinion here. Noun, adjective, adverb. Okay, so let's remember our tests. How can we test whether a word like what a word like happy is? What made you change your mind, Kiwi? So happiness, Tuffy, is a noun, right? The happy is here. Yeah, exactly, Kiwi. But notice you can say very happy. Remember, very is going to go with either adjectives or adverbs, right? So it eliminates noun. Happiness is the noun form, right? But we still have the question of, is this an adjective or an adverb? Now, Santolo was happy, adverb. So George was happy. Like, let's remember, I was going back and forth with So about this last week. We're remember that some verbs, like after some verbs after them appears an adverb, but after other verbs, it can be an adjective. And so what you have to ask yourself, if you have like James was happy, right? Is happy there modifying the verb, or is it telling you an attribute of James? Because if it's telling you an attribute of James, then the verb is what we call a linking verb. And, you know, happy isn't actually modifying it. It's modifying James. One other way you can tell is try substituting something in that slot that you are absolutely positive is an adverb, right? So remember, a lot of adverbs have ly at the end of them, right? So how about, let's see, something like slowly, right? Can you say he was slowly? I mean, quietly with the result, one thing is because these are just phrases and they're not part of a larger sentence, you could say quietly with the result, but I mean, that could work in a different thing. So, but can you say, you can say he was happy with the result, but can you say he was slowly, and you can say he was slow with the result, but can you say he was slowly with the result? You can't, right? The reason you can't is because an adjective can go in that slot, but an adverb cannot, right? So, and notice we do have an adverb form of happy, happily, right? We can add the ly to make an unambiguous adverb. So happy, in fact, is an adjective. So the whole thing here is an adjective phrase. How about very quietly? That's right, Kiwi? Yep. This one, 'tis walk happily. Yes, Centolo, exactly. So notice the difference. Was happy, that's a linking verb. Walk, that's an action verb. So happily there is telling us how he walked, right? And basically, so what we have, and next week I'm going to go into verb phrases in great detail, but what we have here basically are two different subtypes of verbs. Some verbs can be followed by an adjective phrase, right? Other verbs aren't. Other verbs are, you know, like an adverb will modify them. What about through the tunnel? Jivan finished. Amazing. Good for him. Another person on the beach. Preposition is absolutely right. Now, the one comment I would have on this is, so this is a preposition phrase, right? Actually, I have two comments on this. First of all, in traditional grammar, that I'm not following you, Santolo. Yeah. Oh, birthday. Yes, of course it is. I wished him happy. What a birthday, indeed. That's amazing. A great gift to himself. Yeah, I knew it was his birthday. I actually wished him happy birthday in Discord earlier. It was great timing. So the two things I want to note about preposition phrases. First, just a matter of labeling. In most traditional grammar, these are called prepositional phrases. The reason why I'm calling them preposition phrases is to be consistent, right? So in every case, we're just saying noun phrase, verb phrase. So I'm not saying, notice, nominal phrase or verbal phrase or adjectival phrase, right? It's not like they resemble nouns or resemble verbs or whatever. It's just a phrase that's has a head word of a noun, right? Noun phrase. So to be consistent, we should say preposition phrase. So that is not a mistake. If you're used to hearing prepositional phrase, preposition phrase is not a mistake on my part. It's not a typo. It's just me deliberately giving a consistent naming scheme to the way these things work. The second thing I wanted to mention is sometimes people have trouble seeing why this is a preposition phrase. In other words, why are we saying that the preposition is the head word here and not tunnel? Like, isn't this about tunnels in some sense, right? And if you think about it, like if you think about this whole phrase and where we would use it in a sentence, right? What kind of information are we specifying if we say, for example, the train went through the tunnel? You're on the right track, Kiwi, exactly. If we say the train went through the tunnel, that whole thing is about the direction, exactly, Santal, the direction that the train is going, right? So the tunnel is specifying something about, like, where you're going through. Now, because this is a pretty clear directional preposition, it's kind of easy to see this in terms of giving the information for it. But the fact that the preposition heads the phrase is true even when the preposition is very grammatical and you don't have a really clear sense of the meaning. Classic example of this is of. Like if I say of something, right? It might not be clear exactly what of means because it doesn't have a clear spatial or temporal meaning, but it's still a preposition phrase. All right. The next thing I want to note about phrases is phrase is a technical term in grammar. It also has an existence as a common word that people use all the time. You have to be careful not to mix up those uses. In ordinary use, when people use phrase, they often simply mean it's more than one word in a row that somehow forms some kind of group. So for example, you can see this example here, Fedra must have been caught unawares by the WLF. Okay. Must have been caught. That seems like a group, right? Because it's capturing all the verbs. So sometimes you will see or hear people refer to something like this as a verb phrase. Unaware versus unawares is one of those things that's in free variation. You can do either one. Like toward and towards. However, that string of words is not a phrase in our sense. I'm going to show you some tests for phrasehood and stuff later, and I'm going to explain why I'm organizing it this way. But I've put brackets here to show you how the phrases actually work here. So caught unawares by the WLF. So that is a phrase, right? That final verb caught, right? And then all the other stuff that goes with it is a phrase. And then that's inside a bigger phrase. So been caught unawares, that's a phrase. And then have been caught unawares by WLF, that's a phrase. And then must have been caught unawares, that is a phrase. But notice you can't just take, so each of these verbs must have been caught, right, belongs to a separate structure. They don't, as a string of words, form a single unit. Yeah. So I'll be talking in detail about verb phrase structure next week. I'm just sort of using this as a common example of something, like you can't just, in other words, pick out any random string of words and say, oh, that's a phrase, right? It has to have a unified function. And there are tests, which I'll give you the important ones a little bit later tonight, that will let you tell whether something is a single phrase or not, right? Has to be one constituent, right? So, words that cross these boundaries like this are not going to be phrases. The other thing, remember the definition I gave you. It said a phrase is formed around one central word and optional dependent items. Because those items are optional, that means that it is not a contradiction to say that we have a one-word phrase. Right? So, for example, a pronoun, if I say, let's just use this example. Phaedra must have been caught unaware by the WLF. So Phaedra, that's a one-word subject, right? That is a phrase. That is a noun phrase. It's a one-word noun phrase. Pronouns are one-word noun phrases as well. The other consequence of this definition, right, is I'm telling you that it must be organized around a single head word. Ellie and Dina, right? Is either word there the central word in that string of words? Hey, Mickey, how you doing? Exactly, Kiwi. They are grouped together. And the and establishes a kind of equal relationship. They hold the same weight, perfectly expressed. Neither is central. Exactly. So this is actually not a phrase. Ellie by herself is a phrase. Dina, I should say itself because we're talking about the words, not the people. Dina by itself is a phrase, right? The two together is a coordination of two noun phrases, two one-word noun phrases. But this coordination is not a phrase. Okay. And again, things like Ellie and Dina, people will commonly say they're a phrase in a non-technical sense. Okay, fine, right? It is a constituent. A coordination is a constituent, right? But in our technical sense, it's not a phrase. Okay. If it's not organized around that one head word, it's something else. It might be a constituent like Ellie and Dina. It might just be a string of words that have some kind of logical relation to each other, but not a direct, independent grammatical group like must have been caught, right? But not a phrase. Does that make sense to everyone? Golden. Excellent. Now, the other thing. Oh, hey, Moonwraith. I'm glad. I hope I know more than your high school English teacher. Your high school English teacher was not teaching this way. I'd bet dollars to donuts. I mean, to be fair to them, they don't have time in the curriculum to spend this much time looking in detail about the language. So even if they had the actual knowledge base to teach what I'm teaching you, they don't have the time for it. Oh, holy crap. Flirting with his students. Damn. Yeah, that's not good at all. Yeah, very gross. Yeah, you're not an idiot for getting it wrong. You attempted it, and that's what counts, right? And besides, I deliberately gave you something that would push you, right? I was pleased. Well, I mean, I would have been thrilled if somebody could have like seen their way through the traps without my help, but don't expect it, right? This is not the sort of thing that is just, especially when you're first starting out to analyze language, is particularly obvious. Um, all right. Hey, no worries, Mickey. No worries. I'm gonna put the answer key in Discord after this class is concluded, so you can check against. And I put a few notes. You came in late. I explained a couple. I spent some time explaining the logic behind some of the trickier things, so you can review the earlier part of the VOD if you want to understand why something that looks like an adjective is actually a noun, and something that looks like a noun is actually an adjective. Right? So, now, what I was just talking about in terms of labeling phrases, we got noun phrases, verb phrases, etc. Right? What we're doing there is we are labeling the form of the phrase, grammatical form, right? Yeah, no worries. I'm giving people homework because some people requested it, right? But my hope is you can take a lot from this without just by sort of being here, participating, answering questions, thinking through stuff in class. Hopefully, you can get a lot out of it, right? You will definitely fix that knowledge more if you go through some of the exercises offline, but I'm not trying to make this like a really, you know, heavy class, right? Because you all are here just because you're interested, right? So, um, in addition to form, we also have to think about other issues here, right? So, noun phrases have form, but noun phrases can be used in different places in the sentence, right? Her dog chases the rabbits. So, her dog and the rabbits are both noun phrases, right? Do you know? I haven't really talked about these roles. We'll get into them in more detail later, but do you know what function her dog has in this sentence? Yes, that's right, Mickey. Her dog is the subject. What about the rabbit? Chases is part of a phrase, but we're ignoring that for the purpose of this question. It's an object. To be specific, it's the direct object, right? Um, the point here is we've got two different functions in the sentence, right? We've got the subject and we've got the direct object, and they are both filled by noun phrases. So the same form can have different functions. Now, chases the rabbits is also a phrase. Remember when I said that we have that Russian doll structure to syntax, right? So the verb phrase chases the rabbits contains a noun phrase, the rabbits, as a part of that. In addition to the same form having different functions, the opposite is also true. The same function can have different forms. So notice his happiness was evident. So his happiness, what kind of phrase is that? The question was, what kind of phrase is his happiness? Now remember, we decided happy was an adjective, but what is happiness? It's a noun, yes. And so his happiness is a noun phrase. Exactly. His pronoun is possessive pronoun. It's pointing at, possessive pronouns or genitive pronouns are going to be appearing as part of a noun phrase. So his happiness, noun phrase. Now notice that he was happy. I haven't given you the terminology for this yet, so you just have to trust me on this for the moment. This is a clause. Notice we have he, subject, was, verb, and there happy is an adjective, right? So that he was happy was evident. So that he was happy, it was evident. So notice that he was happy is sitting in the slot, the subject slot of the sentence, but that's not a noun phrase. That is an entire clause, okay? So a noun phrase can be a subject, they usually are, but other things can be subjects too. Same function, different forms, right? Therefore, I mean, the basic point here is make sure you rigorously distinguish form and function, right? I think I mentioned this very early on, that this was one of those things I was going to keep coming back to. If you can keep those two ideas separate, we'll see a lot of cases where doing so makes all of the sort of grammatical stuff much more comprehensible. It's when you get them fuzzy and blurred in your mind that you're going to start to get confused about a lot of things. So just keep those straight. Now, in addition to grammatical, those things like subject or direct object, those are grammatical functions. That is not the same thing as the semantic role. In other words, the kind of meaning-based attribute that these things have, right? So think about the difference in the subject of each of these sentences. I'll give you a minute to assimilate them, right? What's different about the role of the subject here in Ellie broke the window versus the brick broke the window? Yeah. Yeah, that's a nice concise way of putting it, Kiwi. When we say Ellie broke the window, we're talking about what is often called the actor in the sentence, right? The person, the agent responsible for it, right? When we say the brick broke the window, right? The brick isn't, unless we live in some strange fantasy world. Yeah, the brick broke the window because Ellie threw it. Yeah. In other words, the brick here is not the actor, the human agent doing the breaking. The brick is the instrument by which the window was broken. So notice, whether it's the actor or the instrument, they can both serve as the subject. And so in addition to distinguishing form and grammatical function, we also need to add what's traditionally called the semantic role. Right? And we'll talk about these later in more detail, but again, I just sort of want to give you the overview right now. So Ellie broke the window, she's the agent. The brick broke the window, that's the instrument. What would you say is going on in this, I used this example the other week, but what would you say the subject is happening with the subject in Tommy John underwent surgery? Being done, yes. So notice if Tommy John is performing the surgery, he would be the actor. But Tommy John isn't doing the surgery, right? Santolo is right. It's being done to Tommy. Notice the verb is not passive. The verb is not, like the surgery was done to Tommy John, right? We don't have that kind of construction. But nonetheless, the subject here is not doing the action. The subject is receiving the action. In fact, the traditional name for this role is actually called the patient. Right. Yeah, if the subject is actively performing the action, then it's the actor, right? In the case of Tommy John here, Tommy John is the patient, both literally in the sense of what the sentence is saying, but also that role, the patient, for one that is just the general term for someone or something that receives the action, that has something done to it, right? So again, 3 subjects, all noun phrases, right? But all having different semantic roles. Any questions about those distinctions? Hi, Emmy, how you doing?